A trigger effect is an effect that can only be activated when a particular condition is met. Trigger effects are all considered to be speed spell 1 and activate at the start of a new chain. In this video, we will be discussing trigger effects that activate in the graveyard or in the hand. Specifically, we will be discussing Virtual World Hime Nyannyan, which is a card that is currently being played in Virtual World, and many duelists ask about its trigger effect. But we'll look at other examples that are similar, such as Altergeist Multifaker, Diabolos Lord of the Lair, and Time Thief Chronocoder, and why some of them can or cannot activate at certain times, and the difference between trigger effects that are met while in the hand or in the graveyard. If you're new to the Legacy Crusaders YouTube channel, my name is Benji, and this is the Ask Judge Man series, where I discuss rulings in Yu-Gi-Oh! If you're interested in other ruling content, check out the rest of the Ask Judge Man series in the playlist in the iCard above. Consider subscribing to be notified when our next video is released, or check out the How to Play series to learn how to play different archetypes as they are released into the game. Virtual World Hime Nyannyan has an effect that if a level 3 monster is normal or special summoned to your field while this card is in the graveyard, you can special summon it as a tuner, but it is banished when it leaves a field. The question most players have been asking recently is that if you were to send Nyannyan to the graveyard with the effect of Virtual World Lulu, would you be able to special summon Nyannyan from the graveyard using its trigger effect, because Lulu is level 3, and it was special summoned? The answer is no, and the reason for this is that Virtual World Lulu's card text says, "And if you do," which is to send a card from the deck to the graveyard and then to special summon itself. That means that these effects occur simultaneously, meaning that Nyannyan would not be in the graveyard when Lulu's effect resolves to summon itself. They would be placed onto the field and into the graveyard at the same time. Therefore, Nyannyan was not in the graveyard to activate its effect. In another series you can find on this channel called Singles Only, I'm playing a Time Thief deck, and in that Time Thief deck I play a card called Time Thief Chronocoder, which happens to have a similar scenario come up between Nyannyan and Lulu, as it does with Chronocoder and Time Thief Redoer. Only Time Thief Chronocoder can summon itself. Let's look at why it is able to, but Nyannyan is not. Time Thief Chronocoder will often be attached to Time Thief Redoer as an Xyz material. Time Thief Redoer has an effect that allows it to detach different types of cards that are attached to it, such as monsters, spells, and or traps, meaning you can do any amount of those, but only one of each, to resolve multiple effects. Detaching to activate Time Thief Redoer's effects is not a cost, but the wording of its effect does mean that a detach does occur prior to resolving its effect. Its effect for detaching a monster is to banish it from the field until the end phase of the turn, which, if a Time Thief Chronocoder was in the graveyard, would meet its trigger effect, which is to special summon itself from the graveyard if an Xyz monster leaves the field by a card effect. Time Thief Redoer would leave the field by its own effect, allowing Chronocoder to activate. But because of the wording on Time Thief Redoer, where it says, detach that type of card, then resolve these effects, Chronocoder would be detached as a monster if it is the card chosen to be detached, therefore in the graveyard, in the middle of the effect, but prior to the banishing of the Time Thief Redoer, meaning its trigger is met because those two things are considered to have happened separately, even though they did occur during the same chain. And trigger effects activate and resolve in the following chain when their trigger has been met. So the big difference between this scenario and the scenario with Nyannyan is that Lulu specifically says, "and if you do," which according to problem-solving card text is considered to happen simultaneously, while detach then implies that the detaching and the effect resolving for Time Thief Redoer is considered to occur in sequence, rather than simultaneously. One of the more interesting cards with a trigger effect that occurs in the graveyard is Diabolos Lord of the Lair, who says if a dark monster is tributed that you control, you can activate this effect if this card was in the graveyard when the monster was tributed, to special summon this card from the graveyard. But it also has a secondary method of summoning itself, using the same trigger in the hand, even if it was not there when the monster was tributed. This means if Diabolos is in the graveyard, when the monster is tributed you can activate its effect, but not if later in the chain Darkest Diabolos appears in the graveyard using some sort of card effect that either sent it from the field to the graveyard, or sent it from the deck to the graveyard, or moved it from the hand to the graveyard. It had to be there prior to when the monster is tributed and when the chain resolves. Now, there are several cards that have this effect that allows them to activate while they're in the hand, and they function similar to how Darkest Diabolos does when it mentions even if not. That text implies that if Darkest Diabolos is added to the hand after the monster is tributed, whether it be by a card effect or drawn from a card effect, that you would be able to activate Darkest Diabolos even though it wound up in your hand after the monster was tributed, but as long as it occurred during the chain prior to when the trigger would be allowed to activate. Cards with similar effects that can activate if they make it into the hand after the trigger is met, but at the resolution of the chain, include Altergeist Multifaker, who can activate in the hand if a trap card has resolved. That's why you're allowed to activate Multifaker if it is added to the hand by the effect of Personal Spoofing. Personal Spoofing has just resolved, and Altergeist Multifaker is in your hand. It doesn't matter if it made it into your hand after the fact. The reason this is allowed is because cards in your hand are considered private knowledge. There is no way to know if you already had a Multifaker in your hand or not, if you had a Darkest Diabolos in your hand or not, if you had a Salamangreat Gazelle in your hand or not, upon the resolution of an effect, with the exception that it is the only card in your hand or all cards in your hand are known. The game is designed to be played as if no cards can be known at any point that are in private locations. So even though we are very much aware that the card made it into the hand at the resolution of another effect, we have to assume that the card could have been there beforehand. That's just the way cards like this function. You assume that they could have been in the hand regardless of how they got into the hand. An exception is not made just because we are very much aware of where the card came from, or the card is limited to one and it is the only possible copy that could have been there. While we're talking about trigger effects, we should also discuss cards that when they are triggered simultaneously. An example that we should mention is when Dark Hole is activated, destroying multiple monsters on the field that activate when they're sent to the graveyard. In a scenario where multiple trigger effects meet their trigger at the same time, trigger effects are placed onto a chain in a particular order. You start with mandatory effects of the turn player. If I had 3 of them, I would put them onto the chain in the orders I would like, for chain link 1, 2, and 3, followed by the mandatory effects of the opposing player. If they had 2 of them, they would put them on the chain as chain link 4 and 5. Then we follow up with the optional trigger effects of the turn player. If I had 1 of them, it would have to be chain link 6. Or it could not be on the chain at all if I choose not to activate it, because it is an optional effect, followed by the opposing player's optional trigger effects. Let's say they had 2 of them. They would be 6 and 7. And now I would not be allowed to activate my optional trigger effect because I've passed on the opportunity to do that when I was supposed to. The last thing I wanted to mention about trigger effects is that if there are multiple trigger effects in the hand that would special summon a monster, you can only use one in a particular chain. This is not in the rulebook, and it is something that every player should know. An example of when this would occur is if a Salamangreat player were to go into a copy of Salamangreat Balinx using a Salamangreat Spinny. They have now met the trigger condition for both Salamangreat Gazelle and Salamangreat Fowl. Gazelle because the Spinny has been sent to the graveyard, and the Fowl because the Balinx has been summoned. But you can only choose to activate one of their effects in this chain, because they both include an effect to special summon themselves, and both of their triggers were met simultaneously. In this scenario, it probably makes more sense to activate Balinx as chainlink 1, Gazelle as chainlink 2, summon Gazelle at the resolution of the chain, add Salamangreat Sanctuary to your hand as chainlink 1 for the effect of Balinx, and then on the resolution of that chain, activate Gazelle to send a card from deck to grave as chainlink 1, and then you can activate Fowl as chainlink 2. It is now a separate chain, so you can perform the chain in this sequence to prevent your Gazelle from being ash blossomed. In both chains I just described, they each only included one effect that would be special summoned from the hand at any particular point, and they both consisted of only optional trigger effects from one player, which is more common than multiple players having multiple trigger effects going off simultaneously. If you have any other questions regarding trigger effects, you can leave them in the comments below. I'll make sure to read them and perhaps use them to make our next video. If you have a better idea about what the next episode of Ask Judgeman should be based on, you can also leave that down in the comments. Make sure you check out the playlist of other episodes of Ask Judgeman here on the end screen, and make sure to subscribe to make sure you don't miss our next episode. Hopefully you learned something in this video, and you'll misplay less and win more.